hushed history, and I want you to find a place where you can fully relax and let the outside world fade away into the background as you get comfortable for the story I am about to share with you. The night of February 19th, 1994 began as a typical fast-paced Saturday for the staff at Riverside General Hospital in Southern California. The emergency room was functioning with its usual rhythm of steady patients and beeping monitors until an ambulance arrived shortly after 8 o'clock in the evening. Inside that ambulance was a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez, a young mother who had been fighting a long and exhausting battle against late-stage cervical cancer. But on this specific night, her condition had taken a turn for the absolute worst, and she was brought through the double doors in a state of total physical collapse. Her heart was racing at a dangerous speed of over 160 beats per minute, and her blood pressure was dropping so rapidly that it barely registered on the equipment. The medical team rushed her into the small, confined space of Trauma Room 1, a place where the air was usually sterile and the movements were always practiced and precise. As the doctors and nurses began the frantic work of hooking her up to life support, the first sign that something was deeply wrong began to manifest on her skin. As they cut away her clothing to place the cardiac electrodes, a nurse noticed a strange, oily sheen that seemed to cover Gloria's entire torso and arms. Under the harsh, unyielding fluorescent lights of the trauma room, her body glistened with a thick, synthetic film that looked more like industrial grease than anything human. Almost at the exact same moment, a heavy, and confusing scent began to rise from the gurney, filling the small room and sticking to the back of the medical team's throats. Some of the staff later described it as a sickly sweet floral perfume that had somehow rotted, while others were hit by a wave of raw garlic so pungent it made their eyes water. The primary nurse, Susan Kane, leaned over the patient to draw a sample of blood for the laboratory to analyze, but the moment the needle entered the vein, the atmosphere turned lethal. As the plastic syringe filled with the dark crimson fluid, Susan was hit by a sharp chemical blast of ammonia that was so concentrated it made her head spin and her lungs burn. She passed the vial to a resident named Julie Gorchinsky, who held the blood up to the light to see if there were any obvious clues to the patient's distress. What Julie saw inside that tube defied every single rule of medical science she had ever studied during her long years of training and residency. Floating within the warm, red human blood were dozens of tiny manila-colored crystals, shimmering like shards of fine glass or grains of salt that had no business existing in a body. Before a single word could be spoken to alert the others, Susan Kane gasped as her face began to turn a bright, burning red, and her eyes rolled back into her head. She collapsed heavily onto the hard linoleum floor, falling into a deep state of unconsciousness that sent a shock wave of fear through the remaining staff members. The room descended into a total nightmare as Julie Gorchinsky also began to feel a metallic, bitter taste flooding her mouth and a wave of heat wash over her skin. She tried to reach for the wall to steady herself, but her legs turned to lead and she crumbled to the ground next to the gurney as her vision began to tunnel. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was the next to go down, her body seized by violent muscle tremors that looked like she was being electrocuted from the inside out. By this point, the air in Trauma Room 1 had become so thick with an invisible, toxic force that anyone who stepped inside was risking their own life. The hospital administration realized they were dealing with an unprecedented mass poisoning event and immediately triggered a code orange, which meant a total evacuation. The scene in the parking lot was surreal and apocalyptic as dozens of patients were rolled out onto the cold asphalt in the middle of the night to escape the fumes. Doctors and nurses were being treated as patients, lying on stretchers with oxygen masks over their faces while they watched their workplace become a sealed-off dead zone. Three staff members were eventually struck down by the mysterious agent, with some suffering from temporary paralysis and others facing permanent neurological damage. While the rest of the building was being cleared, a few brave doctors stayed behind in that poisoned room, desperately performing chest compressions on Gloria. They fought for 45 minutes straight, their own lungs screaming for fresh air, but Gloria Ramirez was finally pronounced dead at 10:45 that night. The end of her life was only the beginning of a massive forensic mystery that would bring in experts from the highest levels of the federal government. When the hazmat teams finally went in with their specialized rubber suits and breathing apparatus, they expected to find a gas leak or a spilled chemical in the hospital's pipes. Instead, their sophisticated sensors showed that the air was perfectly clean, leading to the terrifying realization that the poison had been manufactured inside the woman herself. The body was sealed in a special airtight aluminum container and moved to a secure location as the story of the toxic lady began to break across national news headlines. Every detail of Gloria's life was scrutinized, from the food she ate to the household products she used, in an attempt to find a logical explanation for the chemical weapon her body had become. Yet, the more the investigators dug into the chemistry of her blood and the symptoms of the staph, the more they realized they were facing something that had never happened before. This case would go on to spark fierce debates about medical anomalies, mass hysteria, and potential cover-ups that still linger in the halls of that hospital to this very day. The survivors were left to wonder if they had been exposed to a one-time chemical fluke, or if there was something far more sinister hiding in the shadows of the medical record. The aftermath of the death of Gloria Ramirez left the hospital in a state of clinical shock as the investigators moved in to find out why a human body had reacted like a chemical spill. The emergency room remained a sealed zone for days, while experts in heavy protective gear scrubbed every surface and tested every vent for traces of nerve gas or industrial cleaners. The public was demanding answers as the media picked up the story of the toxic lady and began to spin theories that ranged from the plausible to the completely supernatural. Inside the morgue, the mystery only deepened as the forensic team prepared to perform an autopsy on a body that was still considered a high-level biological threat. The pathologists had to wear specialized suits with their own independent air supplies just to stand in the same room as the aluminum crate that held Gloria's remains. Every time they opened the container, they feared that the same invisible force that struck down the emergency room staff would leak out and claim more victims. The initial results of the autopsy were confusing because they showed that Gloria had died from kidney failure related to her cancer, which was expected, but it did not explain the fumes. The investigators began to look closer at the strange oily sheen and the crystals that the medical residents had seen in the blood samples that night. They found that Gloria had been using a substance called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, as a home remedy to try and manage the intense pain caused by her late-stage cancer. DMSO is a powerful industrial solvent that is often used by athletes to reduce swelling, and it is known to have a very distinct and pungent odor that smells exactly like raw garlic. The theory began to form that Gloria had been rubbing this gel all over her body in such high concentrations that it had saturated her skin and built up in her bloodstream. When the paramedics placed an oxygen mask over her face in the ambulance, the extra oxygen began to react with the DMSO that was already in her system. This chemical reaction would have converted the relatively harmless solvent into a different compound known as dimethyl sulfone, which is known to crystallize at room temperature. This would perfectly explain the manila-colored crystals that Julie Gorczynski saw floating in the blood syringe when it was pulled from the warm body into the cooler air of the room. the most terrifying part of the theory was what happened next when the medical team used a defibrillator to try and shock Gloria's heart back into a rhythm. The forensic scientists believed that the electric shocks from the paddles provided the energy needed to trigger a final catastrophic chemical transformation inside her veins. The dimethyl sulfone may have been converted into dimethyl sulfate, which is a highly toxic and volatile chemical weapon that can cause immediate paralysis and respiratory failure. If this were true, it meant that the doctors and nurses had unintentionally turned their patient into a living gas chamber while they were trying to save her life. Dimethyl sulfate is so dangerous that even a tiny amount of exposure to the vapors can lead to the exact symptoms that the Riverside General staff experienced that night. It causes the eyes to burn, the throat to close up, and the nervous system to misfire, leading to the seizures and fainting spells that sent 23 people to the parking lot. However, this theory was not accepted by everyone, and many chemical experts argued that such a reaction was nearly impossible to achieve inside a human body at those temperatures. The skeptics pointed out that the amount of energy required to create dimethyl sulfate is usually found in a laboratory setting, not in a dying woman's circulatory system. This led to a divide between the official government reports and the personal beliefs of the people who were actually in Trauma Room 1 that night. The hospital staff felt that the DMSO theory was a convenient way for the administration to avoid a massive lawsuit by blaming the patient's own home remedies. argued that the smell of ammonia they all reported was never fully explained by the chemical theory, and they suspected there was something else in the room that was being hidden. Rumors began to circulate among the nurses that the hospital might have had a secret leak in their medical gas lines, or that they were using experimental cleaning agents. The family of Gloria Ramirez was also outraged by the findings, feeling that the hospital was dragging her name through the dirt to cover up their own professional negligence. They hired their own private investigators and forensic specialists to look into the case, but they were often blocked by the hospital's legal team and the local coroner's office. The body was eventually released for burial, but only after it had been heartlessly treated as a piece of hazardous waste for weeks on end. The mystery remained a dark cloud over the city of Riverside, and the survivors of the event were left to deal with the physical and emotional fallout of that terrifying night. Julie Gorczynski spent weeks in intensive care and suffered from a condition called avascular necrosis, which meant her bone tissue was literally dying because of the toxic exposure. She and several other staff members filed lawsuits against the county, claiming that the hospital environment was unsafe and that the investigation was a total sham. As the legal battles heated up, the scientific community continued to debate whether the toxic lady was a freak of chemistry or a victim of a much larger institutional failure. The documents revealed during the discovery phase of the trials showed a series of inconsistencies in the way the blood samples were handled and how the room was tested. It seemed that the more people looked for a straight answer, the more the facts began to blur into a haze of conflicting testimonies and missing evidence. The story was no longer just about a medical tragedy. It had become a fight for the truth in a world where the science didn't seem to add up. The search for a definitive answer in the case of Gloria Ramirez eventually led to a conclusion that many found just as disturbing as the event itself. The official report released by the state of California concluded that the staff at Riverside General Hospital had not been poisoned by a chemical weapon at all. Instead, the investigators suggested that the entire event was a case of mass sociogenic illness, a phenomenon more commonly known as mass hysteria. They argued that the high-stress environment of the emergency room, combined with the strange smell of the patient, triggered a psychological chain reaction. According to this theory, once the first nurse fainted, the minds of the other staff members subconsciously manifested the same physical symptoms out of sheer panic. This conclusion was met with immediate and fierce resistance from the medical professionals who had actually been in the room and felt the physical toll. Julie Gorczynski was particularly insulted by the suggestion, pointing to the fact that she had spent 2 weeks in the hospital and suffered permanent bone damage. She argued that mass hysteria does not cause a person's bone tissue to die or lead to the severe respiratory distress that nearly took her life that night. The scientific community remained divided, as the dimethyl sulfate theory was the only one that provided a chemical explanation for the manila-colored crystals and the oily skin. even though the reaction was difficult to replicate in a laboratory. It stood as a more logical answer to those who valued the physical evidence over psychological theories. The mystery of the toxic lady eventually faded from the front pages of the newspapers, but the legacy of that night changed the way hospitals handle unidentified odors. Today, emergency rooms across the world have much stricter protocols for hazardous materials, ensuring that a single patient can never again incapacitate an entire department. Gloria Ramirez was eventually laid to rest in an unmarked grave for a period of time before her family could finally give her a proper headstone in Riverside. Her family continues to maintain that she was a victim of a hospital that was ill-equipped to handle a unique medical crisis and chose to blame the dead instead of their own failings. The truth of what happened inside Trauma Room 1 may never be fully understood, as the chemical evidence has long since degraded and the witnesses have moved on with their lives. It remains one of the most chilling chapters in medical history, a reminder that the human body is a complex chemical factory that still holds many secrets. Whether it was a freak reaction of home remedies or a failure of the hospital's infrastructure, the story of Gloria Ramirez serves as a haunting warning to us all. It reminds us that even in a world of advanced technology and modern medicine, there are moments where the natural world can still catch us completely off guard. The shadows of that Saturday night in 1994 still linger in the stories told by those who survived the invisible mist. They are the ones who remember the smell of garlic and the sight of the shimmering crystals and they know that what they experienced was very real and very dangerous. As we close the file on this investigation, I want to thank you for spending this time with me tonight to explore the edges of the unexplained. If you found this deep dive into the mysteries of our past intriguing, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. By joining our community, you will ensure that you never miss our future investigations into the strange and forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these hushed stories into the light where they can finally be understood and remembered. We have many more mysteries to uncover, from the depths of the ocean to the silent reaches of space, and I look forward to sharing them with you.